Welcome, folks. You are listening to the A Minute to Midnight show. This is Tony. Today on the show we have Gary Wayne. The first time we've had Gary on the show. I am recording this retrospectively, and I'll definitely say this is a very, very interesting interview, and I'd love to get Gary back soon. I hope you enjoy it. I very, very much enjoyed having him on the show. On behalf of the A Minute to Midnight team, I want to extend a very warm welcome to Gary Wayne. It's really good to have you on the show today, Gary.
Well, so happy to be here with you, and very much looking forward to the discussion we're going to have, and thinking that the audience just may raise some curiosity in them on some things that they haven't thought about before, and hopefully that they'll pursue these things a little bit further after we're done. Yes,
I'm sure will be fascinating. You've written a book called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy: How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Mankind. Now, that right off the bat is a very interesting title that's bound to generate some interest from people, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's either going to grab your interest or you're going to walk away with it shaking your head. So but I wanted to have a title that was going to grab people's attention. So it's one of those books let me just talk a little bit about it. I mean, it is a 6,000 year investigation and a connect the dots investigation into how the descendants of giants partner with the mystical religions and the creation of the secret societies, the fallen angels, and the descendants of Cain to bring about the first apocalypse, the flood, how these peoples and organizations crossed the flood, how they affected the early post-diluvian epoch, and how they affected our history, what they're doing today and what they're planning on doing to bring about the end time and present the Antichrist. So it literally is one of those books that I wanted to tell a complete narrative of the story, and that's what I tried to do throughout the book.
That sounds very interesting, and obviously we'll only be able to scratch the surface of it here in this show, but hopefully it will get people interested to go and get the book. So I'd like just quickly to start off with, what evidence do we actually have that there were giants, that it wasn't just mythology?
Yeah, that's a very, very, very good question. And it's one that is, you come to the conclusion that there was giants through sort of a mixture of fact and all of the different accounts, including mythology and outside of mythology. So giants are one of these groups of people and a race of people, as I'll talk about in my book, that is talked about in pretty much all of the religions around the world. It's in all of the mythologies around the world, all of the legends around the world, and it's always connected to the ancient flood. So we have this basis coming through history that there was this race of giants that seemed to have disappeared. We have reliefs on monuments. We have references and documents. We have, and I'm sure most people are familiar with a lot of the ancient reliefs where you have these gods and these demigods that are significantly larger than the average human. Although a lot of people will say, well, that's just, an artistic license and, imagination run amok. But we do have references from historians all the way throughout not throughout the antediluvian epoch, but from the historical perspective of ancient historians like Josephus, like many of the main names in history of whether or not it's Homer or any of the Greek historians. They're going to make reference to Titans, because the Titans and the Anunnaki and the Diatria and the Myosi and the Azura and all these other different names for giants around the world all have the same story in terms of how they are created. Josephus, which writes down the history of the Jewish people, records these giants and that these bones were on display even up to the time that he was doing this writing, which would have been somewhere between 70 and 100 CE, because he was part of the Jewish rebellion and captured by the Romans to to write this history after he was captured. We also have writings that come through Roman history and Greek history, a little bit more recent. You've got, times, giants recorded in the times of Augustus, who was 9 foot 9 inch. Names like Passio and Sangandila. One is 11 foot 3 inches. The other one was 9'9". You also have Thracian giants in the time of Maximus. You have newspaper writings in North America and around the world, and I'll put these newspaper clippings off the archives up on my Facebook page on a regular basis that are recording giants anywhere from 10 feet to 15 feet all throughout North America, and they range from the dates of, say, around 1850 to about 1950, in that 100-year range. Some of them have very distinct descriptions. Some of them have some sketches from back then. They're all sent to either the local university or to the Smithsonian, and then they sort of mysteriously disappear. So we have elongated skulls being discovered in Peru. We have the giant remains being discovered in like the Serpent Mounds and other places around the United States. And so there's a long history of this strange type of being, just not a lot of recognition or time and attention devoted to it.
Which is interesting in itself, that it's been kept so secret, and everything that goes to the Smithsonian disappears when it's along these type of lines. So,
well, and that probably shouldn't be too surprising, but most people don't know that Smithson wasn't an American. He was actually British, and he was a very important member of the Royal Society. And so after he died, the money goes to start the Smithsonian organization in the United States. And so this all goes back to, because he's also a Rosicrucian, and it goes back to this idea of controlling the information as opposed to just telling us what's going on.
That's interesting that he was a Rosicrucian. I didn't actually know that. So
and Freemason.
Yeah, okay. So it's very much tied into the secret societies, and which is a big part of your book, I believe, how the secret societies actually play into all of this.
Yes. And if people don't know the history of the Royal Society, it's actually created by Rosicrucians and Freemasons in a joint effort, because they're very much related organizations. And there's a couple sort of stutter starts, but officially 1660 and in the charter in 1662 by the king. So when the Royal Society actually begins, and if you don't know who Rosicrucians are and Freemasons, they're very much come from a polytheist belief system, or a Gnostic, as they like to call their religion. And their whole ideology is to advance the sciences, yes, but not in a way that is going to honor or help the cause of Christians. It's there to lead people away from God, to make sure that anything that they discover doesn't go to saying that God actually made it. It's designed to glorify their own pantheon and to lead people away from God. So it's not an open, cold, secular society. It's very much biased in its roots, and I think it's very much biased to this day. And I think we see the effects of that's what science does. Anything that is about intelligent design or anything that might have sort of a biblical implication isn't designed to substantiate it. It's designed to put doubt on it.
Well, how do we actually see them playing into it today? You know, what is the end goal in essence? You know, we're kind of starting at the end and working backwards in a way, but what is the actual end goal of all of this secretiveness and not disclosing giants and human history? Is basically these big question marks around it that are not really brought into the public light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's one of the what I would call probably the biggest conspiracy there ever was and ever will be, because it's this ongoing sort of conspiracy. But their end goal is to actually bring about the end time. And most people might think, well, that's rather odd. Why would they want to do that? Well, they want to bring about the end time because they want the showdown with God and his followers. And they want to fight a battle so that they can win their freedom to live in a separate realm away from God. And that's what this is all about. And they need to bring about the end time so that they can present their Messiah that I'll make a case for in the book will lead back to the bloodlines of the Nephilim that are created in Genesis 6, and that they keep track of these genealogies all the way out, all the way through prehistory and all the way throughout modern history. And they'll present all of these different pedigrees of that Antichrist in the end time to sort of enhance his pedigree and his reputation and his fame, because people are going to, wonder about this individual, but wonder in a way that's in awe and in amazement, and that pedigree is going to be an important part. So they want to bring about this end time. They would like to bring about the end time on a timetable that is not the ordained time. Any time before would be preferable, but they'll accept the ordained time if they have to.
That is a good point, the fact that there is a genealogy. I think a lot of people, when they're looking for an Antichrist, they just think he's going to be rise somewhere like out of a religion like Islam, and I just can't see it. I think there's a long planned, event coming, that they're working towards this for a long time, and that they know who they'll want to set up as their Antichrist.
Yeah, and whether or not they actually succeed or Antichrist does come from a different area doesn't diminish what they're trying to do. And so they keep 3 Antichrist figures within the bloodlines already in place and ready to go so that they're never caught off guard. But we also need to remember from a prophetic perspective is that there are going to be not only many false prophets, but many false messiahs. And so I think because this is not always a monolithic movement, we'll see different Antichrist figures presenting themselves as such in the end time, whether or not it's the Mahdi from Islam, or it's Lord Maitreya from Eastern mysticism, or all the different cultures and peoples around the world. And I think it's all designed to fool people into that the end time is coming to a close sooner than it actually is. And then the real Antichrist will step up by the midpoint of the last 7 years and be crowned as the King of Jerusalem in Jerusalem, which is one of those titles I think people ought to follow because that's part of the pedigree.
Okay, so I've often made the case that there will be a sort of a false Antichrist before the false Messiah, which I think, that is the plan, and that sounds like you're basically saying something similar there.
Yeah, I think there'll be several of them, at least whether or not they reach the same level of popularity as one or two other ones is hard to know, but I do take the Bible literally, and prophecy does say there will be more than one Antichrist figure. So I think we need to be very, very careful as we move into the end time, not to overreact. It will be part of prophecy, but it may not be sort of the quote unquote Antichrist. And we have to understand that there's a certain series of events that are going to happen in the end time. And if we get disgraced because we're falsely calling the time of the rapture, or accusing the wrong people of Antichrist, or we become like an apocalyptic, fanatical group of people, we're not going to be taken seriously at all. And if we're not going to be taken seriously, then how are we going to expect people will listen to us and wake up to what's going on if we're not role modeling in the proper way?
Yeah, I see it's a good point there. I mean, I've lost count, I suppose, of the number of Antichrist, that this person or this group says so-and-so is the Antichrist, and they won't listen to the possibility that they're not. Like there was al-Baghdadi from ISIS, Obama, there's still a big lot of people that are convinced that Obama's the Antichrist, and you've got the Pope, there's a huge people that is absolutely adamant that it's the Pope, and I'm kind of thinking, well, you box yourself into a corner when you do that, because none of us knows exactly what's going to happen or how it's going to play out. And then I think there's the whole alien deception which could play into this as well.
Yes, and I think the alien deception is a significant part of it. And I want to underscore your point about how prophecy almost never unfolds in the manner that people think it's going to unfold, that there are surprises. And so we can't get too far in front of it because, again, we won't be credible in our message if we're caught in too many mistakes. And I agree with you in terms of how many people have been accusing this person and that person of being Antichrist. They may be an Antichrist wannabe, perhaps, but we're nowhere at that point where we can point to somebody and say that's going to be the future Antichrist, because it's going to be a bit of a mystery until we actually see who the actual one is. And when you talk about the alien deception that I think is going to be part of the great deception of the end time, we need to be able to unpack we're currently being brainwashed today, what's behind the alien mythos, and how that's going to be used to deceive the people of the earth to fight in this rebellion, aka in the Star Wars sort of scenario, that you're going to fight against the evil lords of creation to try and live in their own realm. And so they're going to see all sorts of different types of I think alien imposter beings or actual somehow survivor beings from before the flood that are going to be part of this deception. However elaborate that this alien deception is, it's going to be part of the end time. And so we need to understand the language of what the spurious forces are doing. And that's one of the things I try and lay out in my book, to understand who aliens are, what's the relationship to fairies, why are fairies very, very important to the bloodlines, and on and on and on. Because there's a language and a consistency to what they do in terms of telling us what they're going to do beforehand. And for whatever reasons why they feel they need to do that, I don't know, but they seem to, or they just think we're so mundane that we won't understand what they're talking about.
I think most people miss it, and some of us see it, and sometimes you can piece all the pieces together of what they're trying to get across, and sometimes you can't. You just know that there's something being said, but you can't always pinpoint it exactly. And of course they use numerology in everything that they do, so they tie in with that.
Yeah, they would call it sacred geometry and things like that, but it is number mysticism, and again, that comes from Pythagorean mysticism, and that's all part of the 7 sacred sciences that they developed to significant levels in the antediluvian epoch, that then sprung out the secret societies and the mystery schools and the mystical religions that were partnering with these giants that usurped the kingships and formed the dynasties, the royal bloodlines, both before and after the flood. And so again, I don't speak against science and development as being evil. Knowledge isn't evil. It's the application of it and what they tend to do with it that gets them into trouble, will get them into trouble, and got them into trouble before the flood.
You mentioned fairies. That's not something that we've really brought up much in this show. So that perhaps you could tell our listeners a little bit about fairies and what they exactly are.
Well, it's a very large subject, and there are the allegories, and then there are how they break down the classifications of fairies. So let's talk about the 4 different classifications that the occult has for fairies. And the first classification is this group of either, again, if you're from an alien ancient alien mythos, they would classify them as a little bit lower level as an alien, but typically they are a godlike group that comes from other planets, and who rebelled and are led by the proud angel in this respect, and they come to the earth after the rebellion, and they procreate with human females, and they create the second classification, which are the earthly fairies, which we would know as demigods or Nephilim or Titan or Anunnaki or Xibalba, on and on and on. Same type of beings from all around the world, same story. And then the third classification is what they call the spirits and or the daemons and or the banshees. Anyways, the bodiless spirits of these earthborn demigods. And then the fourth classification is the elementals, and that's broken down into three classifications, one being the mischievous class of fairies that most people would know as leprechauns or trickster type of little people. Then you have the good-looking ones that would include some of the elves, white elves, dark elves. And then you also have the gnomes, which has many classifications under it, as do all three of those classifications. And these are the ugly ones, so they'd be like trolls and hobbits and dwarves. And all of these different types of little people have their own specific function in occult history, and including the gnomes, who are the ones who guard the knowledge and the treasure and the genealogies. And these gnomes have one classification in there that are called, in some legends, the little gray neighbors, and some of them just the grays. And they come through portals, fairy mounds, shays, fairy dolmen, and the dolmen would be a megalithic type structure like Stonehenge, only on a lot smaller scale, and dolmen is translated as portal. And they would have these flying machines that come through these portals and kidnap people for a fortnight in the Celtic tradition or the Scottish tradition, and do all sorts of scientific experimentation on them, generally in the area of reproduction, because they seem to need some sort of DNA injection or bloodline injection or something to continue, and then they return the people after a fortnight. I put one of these fairy abductions in my book, and if you didn't know it was a fairy abduction, you'd swear it was a great alien abduction. And so I think the alien fairies of these little peoples are very much related and just sort of tailored to the level of understanding of the culture to the people that they're trying to deceive at that time. So 4 classifications, and these fairies are all antediluvian beings, including the little people that are created before the flood. And somehow, some way, in their occult belief, and we have no record of fairies in the Bible, they survived the flood somehow, some way as well. So either with the help of angels or demons or whatever, in the earth, off the earth, on arcs, whatever, somehow they, in their belief system, that they survive. And I think they're going to be part of this end time. Now, in the allegorical aspect of it, you start getting into the understanding that in the fairy tradition, it is the matriarchal bloodlines of the offspring of the gods or the fallen angels with human females, but from a female perspective. And that'll go back to like Tiamat in the Sumerian pantheon, or Lilith in both, again, Sumerian and or Hebrew, as that shifts over into the occult side of the Hebrew mysticism. And down through down through history of all of these major patriarchs that they like to absorb into that fairy bloodline. And the opposing bloodline allegory would be dragons. So you have dragons, and you also have ravens on the male side as the allegory of the bloodlines, and you have owls, and you have fairies on the female bloodline. Just as this is also part of the Gnostic religion that comes out of the Albigens and the Cathars, and this idea of this bloodline of the Albigens is the elven bloodline that goes back to the gods and the offspring with the human females, which we understand as fallen angels, and Nephilim. So this is an intricate part in their whole belief system.
And what about how they play in good fairies? And we see them in all sorts of fairy tales and stories. That you have these female little fairies, the Tinkerbells and that kind of thing,
Yeah, and Tinkerbell in that application would be one of the good-looking fairies. But what you're referring to, and I'll come back to some of these fairy tales in just a second. So you have within their belief system a good force and an evil force, right? As it's sort of portrayed in Star Wars. And so you would have a good elf and an evil elf. You'll have a good witch and an evil witch, right? But no matter what, this evil witch or a good witch generally will wear a hat that just has a different color and sort of different clothes in the allegories. But it's all a development of the same type of sciences and magic, and the male counterpart would be wizard in this case to a witch, and wizards were the priests of the polytheist religions of the antediluvian epoch, and they come down. We know them as magi as they show up after the flood in Mesopotamia. They'd be similar to the priests of Egypt and the magic and things that they were doing in Egypt. So when we look at how they're portrayed, we have to understand that these fairies are showing, these fairy tales are showing allegories, history, and genealogies to their belief systems. So if you have in Peter Pan, you have this character that's based on the Pan god, who's the god of the woodland, and quite a terrible sort of figure in terms of what it used to do with nymphs, just as Wendy would be a nymph allegory in that classification. And they're in the land of Neverland, which is where you never grow old. So it's like the other world of the Tuatha De Danann, who are also known as the fairy people. I should have mentioned that when I was talking about the classifications. And the Tuatha De Danann were another sort of entity, both before and after the flood, that were giants. And so all of these fairy tales that will include things like the fairy godmother, that is just an allegory back to this matriarchal bloodline and to female goddesses, whether it's Isis or it's Ishtar or it's Astarte or it's Gaia. Doesn't matter which pantheon you look at, because they're essentially all the same pantheon, just with different vernacular names. And so all of these fairy tales are designed to record the genealogies and their history, and some of the modern ones. So if we look at Lord of the Rings, I mean, you see these fairy characters. You actually have elves in there, right? And in this case, you have the good-looking larger elf that has the pointed ears as part of one of the peoples, and you have the dwarves, and in their occult society, dwarves were the people that made tools and did ironworks and lived in the ground and were ugly and made weapons for the giants and their kingdoms, just as they're portrayed in Lord of the Rings. And of course, you have the hobbits, and you have the great wizards, which again represent the magic and the polytheist religion, and you have all of these different peoples before the flood. And at the end of the trilogy, you see all of these different creepy beings surviving and sailing away on a boat, which is an allegory for the flood, because now it's the time of man. So it doesn't really matter which fairy tale you go to, it has these allegories in it, whether or not it's Jack and the Beanstalk with fee fi fo fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. I mean, it's just it just never ends with how it's encoding their belief system.
So do you believe that these writers of all these books and fairy tales are actually part of the secret society and part of the whole dualistic belief system themselves?
Oh, absolutely. They all are, and they're all initiated into that belief system to be able to have the knowledge to write about these things. And it doesn't matter whether or not it's in Europe or it's in North America. a classic example was, even if they're not writing them, they're just promoting them. So Walt Disney is a classic. Everybody knows he's a Freemason, but he was also a Rosicrucian. And I can't think of a better example of one person and one company promoting fairy tales to keep it alive than Walt Disney. And then you look at what his occult history is. Just as, I think Tolkien and Lewis were both occultists as well.
That's throwing in a curly one, the C.S. Lewis, but I know that's going to make some people cringe. So what can you tell us about him?
Well, he is known as as a Christian or a repented Christian, depending on who you talk to. But I mean, everything that he writes about is occultic. There's no Christian sort of principles there whatsoever. And again, I put that out because, again, it's not a coincidence. And I like to talk from a premise of not only what history might show who they were, but what they also did. And during the 30s and 40s, both Tolkien and Lewis were part of a informal literary group that was at university that were called the Inklings. And again, most people might understand or have heard of that group. Many people haven't, but it was certainly an interesting group that, were what I believe were a group that was organized with Masonic connections to utilize the allegories. And in some people's writings, they actually call it a Masonic group. I'm not sure that is totally substantiated, but certainly there's a lot of people that were working, have written about that. But they were both members of a Hermetic order called, the Golden Dawn. And, many assert that both Tolkien and Lewis became members through a person by the name of Williams, who was also part of this group in the Inklings. And so you get this trail of secret society membership that I think is just, you can't ignore the coincidence.
Have you actually got proof that they were part of the Golden Dawn? And I've been wondering I've heard people say the Rothschilds are in the Golden Dawn, but I've not actually found anything, provable on that. Do you know for sure?
Just from people who talk, and are on record on talking from the inside, but there's no physical documentation that I've come across to say that. And unlike the American and North American societies that will produce names and lists, the British ones don't tend to do that, right? So it's very, very hard to get that. But there's people like John Todd who talk about both Lewis and Tolkien, and they're from the inside and are ex-witches, and David Meyer, and there's other people that sort of go on record on that as well. And so what I go about is saying I think there's links there that say that they are, but then when I look at what they wrote, I don't know where else they would get their information except from the Rosicrucians, because this is Rosicrucian knowledge and ideology.
I was a huge fan of a guy by the name of George MacDonald who wrote books. He was a Scottish author, and years ago I read pretty much all his books, reprints of them. But he influenced Tolkien, and I think C.S. Lewis claimed he never wrote a book without quoting from George MacDonald. And G.K. Chesterton, and so, and as I think back to some of MacDonald's beliefs in there, I'm start to wonder, was he actually part of it all as well?
Yeah, and I think there was that sort of whole sort of circle there to kind of bring these ideas into the mainstream that people have been building on for the last 100 years, and they both seem to sort of revel in allegories that were part of the book called, the Worm Oribus by Rucker Edison. And they both seem to use things that in their writings that come directly out of that as well. So again, you get this sort of chain link that is tying them into the occult. But I think I think it's the Williams connection who actually said he was part of the Rosicrucian community and the Order of the Golden Dawn, and being connected to both of those in the Inklings group, whom other writers, and again, that part is speculation, say that they led them into the Rosicrucian order.
That is interesting. Williams, what was his first name? Do you know?
Trying to think of it. I think it was Charles Williams. Pretty sure it's Charles Williams.
Right. Okay.
But I'm going from memory on that. And again, that whole time period, which is also very interesting, if they were connected to them, and I think they were, that's the time of Aleister Crowley.
Yes, and he was part of the Golden Dawn. Well, though I hear
Yes.
I don't know if it's true or not. I heard that he was actually kicked out of the Golden Dawn
A few times, and was always trying to completely take it over. So he kind of had a love-hate relationship there.
Right. Okay. So that is interesting. Now I want to go back a little bit. This is fascinating, and we could go in so many directions.
Just let me make a connection here that shows that they're connected to Williams, because Lewis wrote about Williams's poems, and he said something to the effect that they seemed to him to have had profound wisdom, and to be amongst the 2 or 3 most valuable books of verse ever produced in the century. And they were very much occultic in Williams' writings. So I just wanted to put that in there, that again, on that connection that I was making, that both Tolkien and Lewis actually wrote and commented on Williams's poetry.
Yep. Okay. That's important. So I just want to go back a little bit to the earlier. I was thinking along the lines that we have another group of people I notice out there that are talking about supposed race called Homo capensis, and there's a group of people, Karen Hudis and others, which I think is a side deception, where they believe that there is a second human race, they're not fully human, called Homo capensis, and they're cannibals, and that's where all the sacrifice of children, they all go. But then they start saying that people like Moses were part of the Homo capensis, which is like, whoa, you're starting to go take it off into a whole other direction to discredit. Well, I think it discredits, the biblical account when you start saying that Moses was one of them.
Yeah, that's quite a leap to go from there without even some sort of connection that you could possibly make. To this whole ideology that there was any sort of human cannibalism in Moses or in the Israelites there's nothing there biblically, and there's nothing there that I've ever seen from outside sources. So I'm not sure how they would go from A to B, let alone with this race of people who may be, but they're not really a known sort of race as an individual race that would be recorded either in secular history or in the occult. So, and certainly we don't have that in the Bible. So I'm not even sure how they're arriving with their initial premise, let alone going from point A to point B.
I know, and yet it is become quite a common deception that's being put out there. And I just got to say, from a biblical perspective, Joshua followed Moses, and he was ordered to go in there and kill all the Canaanites and all the giants. So that should straight away, Joshua was like Moses' right-hand man. That should straight away tell you that Moses was not a part of the Nephilim or Homo capensis, whatever you want to call them, because otherwise he wouldn't have had Joshua go in there to spy out the land and kill them all. That should straight away, as far as I'm concerned, discount that entirely. So I don't know how they get there, but I know they have quite a big following, these people.
Yeah. Well, and I'm quite familiar with them trying to draft Moses as being Akhenaten.
Yeah.
And that's why he disappears from history, and taking him back to Heliopolis, where he would have been educated even as an adopted son. But that whole line, and I discuss that in my book, is just so full of holes. But what's important to understand is they believe it and what they're doing with that information.
And it's deceiving a lot of people, and again,
deceiving people.
Yeah,
yes.
And again, like every other deception, they'll say things like, "Only those that are awake will understand this." We're not going to try and convince you if you don't already know this stuff. That sets themselves up on some sort of a pedestal that they have the truth.
Yeah, it's the typical left-wing fascist sort of move that there's no debate, and although they might say that from the Christian perspective as well. But that we're too locked in and we're not open to other ideologies on that. Fair ball. But we have a book that continually is proven to be historically accurate and has a long history that we can go back into history as to the credibility of the book, as opposed to this patchwork of sort of belief system about Moses that is very little history and a lot of imagination.
Yes, okay, yeah, that's a valid point. We do see, though, cannibalism surfacing a lot in ancient history. What are your thoughts on that? What was the purpose in it?
Well, typically that goes back to prehistory and then resurfaces again after the flood. So it all goes back to this understanding of who this group of giants were in Genesis 6. And part of the crimes of the giants, after they usurped the kingships and imposed the polytheistic religion of Cain and his son Enoch on the world, and as a rebelling against the gods, they're not this monolithic movement, and not only do they fight amongst themselves and have wars amongst themselves, they also do appalling things. And they had very, very large appetites, because these were not, as I said, 7-foot people. Some people think that the original giants were somewhere between 20 and 40 feet, although biblically we can only make a case for the size of Og's bed and how big Goliath was. So somewhere between 10 feet and about 14 or 15 feet, even though Amos will talk about them being as big as the cedars in Lebanon, which were giant trees, which would be 35 to 50 feet. So it's probably where there people talk about them somewhere between 20 and 40 feet. But they had these huge appetites that they had to continue to feed, and they used to eat humans on a regular basis, and they used to drink their blood, and they used to sacrifice humans quite regularly, because they looked upon us as being mundane and inferior, because these were the demigods of old, as they believed. And so this whole cannibal idea, especially when you start to mix it into rituals, is one of those things that come from prehistory. And as this organization and these peoples somehow crossed the flood or were recreated after the flood, depending on your perspective on that, they again begin these occult rituals. And it starts for sure at Babel and probably comes up at Sodom and Gomorrah. And in fact, at Babel, Nimrod, who in Scripture is not a direct lineage of giants, and it says he became a Gibberim, but that doesn't necessarily mean giant, but one assumes it is. That generally Gibberim is used for Nephilim, but not always, that somehow he changed because he's the son of Cush and he's not the son of a fallen angel. But this is the individual that Freemasons will say and write about extensively through people like Albert Mackey in the history of Freemasonry, that he partners with Hermes, who finds the two pillars of Lamech and or Enoch, depending on the legend that you're talking about in occult history. And they find the location to the knowledge that were hidden under the pyramids. They bring it back to Babel. And they institute the antediluvian religion that brought down the old world. And Nimrod becomes the first Grand Master of Freemasonry after the flood, writing the first constitution. And their first application of those sciences, or one of the first few applications, would be the building of the ziggurat, the building of the city, because that's the fifth science of geometry, which in the craft they call masonry. And he instituted these barbaric rituals of eating humans and drinking blood.
Yes. Okay. So that's definitely something we could pursue, I'm sure, a little bit more. I would certainly love to have you back on the A Minute to Midnight show. Our time is kind of getting short in this particular one, and I've still got so much more I could ask you. So I'm kind of thinking, we've got to do this again if you're able to sometime in the very near future. Can you tell the listeners again about the name of your book and where they can find it?
Yeah, the name of the book is The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How the Descendants of Secret Societies and Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. And you can get it through Amazon.com or Amazon.uk, Amazon around the world. It's also available through BarnesandNoble.com. Most online bookstores. It is distributed by Bookmasters out of Pennsylvania. So if somebody wanted to order a book in and support their local bookstore, if it wasn't on the shelf, you can order it through Bookmasters. And you can also get the book through my website, www.genesis6conspiracy.com. That's genesis6conspiracy.com with the number 6. And on there, you can link into Kindle and you can link into Barnes & Noble and Amazon from there, or you can get a signed copy from me as well if you want to buy off the website as well, and I'll send that to you. People can also follow me on Facebook under Gary Wayne and 2 Genesis 6 Conspiracy pages, and I also have a group called Gary Wayne, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and you can also follow me on Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63. And if somebody does come to me with a question, I will get back to you with an answer. And I also wanted to add that for any of the people who are outside of the United States or Canada, that if they did want my book, go to my website, www.genesis6conspiracy.com, go to Buy Now, and go to the U.S. page under buying a signed copy from the author, and I'll give the book to you and send it to you for the price that I sell into the United States for, and I will pick up the additional freight myself. So if you fill out on the U.S. page, I will send you the book for that price.
That's great. So when you talk about answers, that's one thing I'd like to just ask you sort of in closing. All this information is good to have and know, but in the end, what do we do with it? How do people apply it? But besides it just becoming knowledge, it's got to have a reason that we know it or need to know it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the main message is to understand where we are today from where we came from, and understanding the end times, we need to look back, just as Jesus said that the end time and his second coming will be like the days of Noah. We need to understand all of that. We need to understand where the universal religion of Babylon comes from, where the Antichrist is going to come from, and why this is just a repetition of the same conspiracy that's been going on since the creation of humankind. And it's important to understand that, because the deception that is coming at us is going to be so strong that even the elect will be deceived if that were possible. And we take it then that it is, that this great deception will fool all of our church leaders. So we need to understand what's in the Bible, and we need to understand what the other side is doing, because ultimately they're trying to deceive as many as possible. And so those deceptions will be so large, unless you're so well versed in Scripture, you're prone to be deceived, because the information that they're going to provide is going to tear Christianity to its knees, and then they're going to try and rebuild it as they enfold it into this polytheist religion of Babylon in the end time, and that they're going to portray Antichrist as being Christ. That's why he's called Antichrist. And if you're not fully understanding of what's going to happen, you're likely going to be deceived.
That's a very, very good point. And the deceptions are already ramping up. I'm noticing it exponentially appearing to ramp up in all directions at the moment, and it is becoming a minefield. So we will have to be very, very, I guess we're going to have to be making sure we're very close to God and very well versed in His Word, so that we're not so easily deceived.
Yeah, that's absolutely key, because that's what we're going to have to rely on. And I think that if we understand how they're going to present the deception, it will be easier to break it down. The risk, though, is even though so many are being so diligent to Scripture today, they get ahead of themselves, just as what we were talking about today. And again, Scripture will have to unfold in prophecy as it's been ordained to unfold. We can't force feed anything, just like the spiritual forces cannot bring the end times on before the restrainer is removed. So we just have to be there and explain it to people and role model as good Christians, and not be running around like crazy people and being perceived as crazy people, because that type of witnessing is not going to save anybody.
Very good point. Well, thank you for coming on the A Minute to Midnight show today, Gary. It's just been fascinating, and I've really enjoyed it, and I'd love to have you come back soon if you can find the time to do it.
I would love to come back, and hoping that the audience liked the discussion as much as I did, because I thought it was a very good discussion today.
So did I, so thank you. Well, I found that very interesting indeed, fascinating interview. I'd love to get Gary back soon if possible. Don't forget you can find all of our A Minute to Midnight episodes and also some other videos on our YouTube channel and on our website, which is aminutemidnight.com, and we put all our shows out as audio only and as video. You can also download them on the website, or you can listen to them on iTunes. We run this entirely by donations, and we really appreciate the people that help us out. We could not keep this running without your help, so thank you to those that donate. You can find a donation button on the YouTube channel, or you can find ways to donate on our website, aminutemidnight.com. I write, play and record all the music that you hear in our shows, and you can find some music on our website as well. We're launching a new forum and a bit of a social media on our website as well, so you can sign up and register for that now as well if you want to. We'd love to have you join in there, especially if you're a regular listener to the A Minute to Midnight show. I think that's about it for this show, so on behalf of the team, I'm signing off until the next episode. God bless, and I hope you all have a great week.